So you just said something I've never thought about, which is really interesting, that the involvement actually of Elon Musk via Doge in these, he's called it a quote revolution. I think most people see it that way, whether they're on the left or the right. Actually, that can play into the political gift that Democrats end up getting if we start seeing massive job loss, especially of people who are already, in some cases, for cultural reasons, sympathetic with the Democratic Party. Like these are the professional managerial class who could potentially be hit by these job losses, and then you tie Elon Musk to it, and you're basically tying Elon Musk to an economic dystopia in ways that aren't fully obvious to us yet. That's a super, super interesting point. The thing I would say is maybe it's both, because I feel like that's actually what we saw with NAFTA, and I think that's what we saw with WTO, and that's where it was always really difficult for the right, which is you did see growth, but then you saw localized decline, and they had a really hard time reckoning the growth with the localized decline, especially as cultural issues started to intertwine with the localized decline. So, for example, if you go to, where my mom is from in northern Wisconsin, where a lot of my family lives, they were hit really hard by NAFTA's old paper mill community, and then opioids crept in, and then you started to see way more sympathy. I mean, this is a district that was held by a Democrat, a very establishment Democrat, for 40 years, flipped in 2010, actually by now Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, but that was pre-MAGA. These trends were already taking place. Donald Trump was just smart enough to sort of see that the culture and the economics were intertwined. But I think that's what the Republican Party always struggled with, was reckoning growth with localized pain, because the growth was not across the board. And so I could see something really similar happening, which is that actually some of this growth is huge, and maybe in places like Austin, and maybe even in places like old Rust Belt places. Like we're seeing a Honda. They're making the Civic in Indiana. Yeah. We'll see if it actually pans out. We've heard this before, making the Civic in Indiana because of these tariffs. And maybe you get still like a boom in Silicon Valley. Palantir is doing amazing, and maybe it absorbs some of the federal workforce in ways that are great for the economy. If that microcosm is expanded elsewhere. So, but then what does that do to Brooklyn? What does that do in other places? And is either party sort of learning from what happened with NAFTA, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I think, what I would expect to happen just based on historically. You brought up NAFTA as an example, but Detroit paid every American now has access to cheaper cars than they would have had if it hadn't been for Japanese competition. So like the American people as a whole benefited, but Detroit paid a huge price for that growth that American consumers got to enjoy.
And Ronald Reagan was one trying to deal with that in the 80s, like godfather of the modern conservative movement. And Bob Lighthizer, who worked for Ronald Reagan, will always defend Reagan's legacy as being more complicated. Because what he did actually with the It was with Honda. It was with motorcycles. There was auto manufacturing. Basically, Reagan had some targeted attempts to save U.S. manufacturing, protect U.S. manufacturing, but it wasn't across the board. And it's sort of like nobody really knows how to reconcile. The conservative movement always had something called fusionism, three-legged stool. So it was the Cold War fusing of the neoconservative movement with the religious right, traditional conservative movement, and the libertarian conservative movement, fiscal conservative movement. And everyone always, the dominant ideology was that these things are intertwined. They always will be intertwined. And when the Cold War ended, Donald Trump was really the first to tell the conservative movement, the first high-profile person. I mean, you could point to Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul, but first high-profile person to say, no, that's not how it is. So it's still really tough for people on the right, especially with now this ascendant strain of libertarianism among Musk and the guys who are coming in from Doge.
Yeah. How is this sort of tech bro movement into politics viewed in Washington? Because I think it feels like this Like people like, I view myself as, again, historically, politically agnostic, and then I kind of woke up to it. I'm a huge fan of technology. I would consider myself probably a libertarian more than anything, like within the sort of the four, if you think about the four things, the quadrants or whatever. Like I'm for more freedom, I'm for more technology, I'm for less government, more personal freedom, so on and so forth. How is this movement viewed in DC, if it's being viewed at all?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the bureaucrat sort of administrative state class predictably despises Doge, and probably for reasons that you'd be familiar with. But for a lot of people, if they don't spend time with people who work for the government, there is this sense of authority. And sometimes it's earned, sometimes it isn't. My dad, spent his entire career working for the state of Wisconsin. And I think his authority on this, when he would be sort of annoyed with people pointing to the private sector being more efficient, I think it was like entirely hard earned. But in other cases, and I think especially in the federal bureaucracy, it's eye roll inducing. So they sort of think that they are the experts, that they have the authority, that they are entitled to not be challenged by people on the outside. So this is a perfect storm to just like blow their brains up. You couldn't like script this in a way that would make them angrier. Bringing in like literal, like in some cases, not all cases, but like literal 20 somethings who
big balls.
have big balls. Yeah, exactly. But I think also on the right, there isn't that sense, people who have worked in government, whatever, they don't have that sense of entitlement and authority. In fact, they've been annoyed by the career bureaucrat sense of entitlement and authority for a long time in the past. But I do sense just from people that I've talked to some cracks in that foundation, because it is true that if you're coming from outside the government, you don't sort of speak the language of politics, you don't speak the language actually of the conservative movement and the right, and maybe even of MAGA, then, you're going to step on some toes. And so it may or may not be tenable. I actually don't know. Big Balls is a good example. Coming in and like nobody here sleeps in their office except for, some congressmen. But like nobody has ever done that. There isn't a work culture like that. A lot of DC is very 9 to 5. So there are just some cultural differences that even on
that's
the
optimistic.
Yes, the conservative in DC is roughly 9 to 5, and definitely not in journalism or like not in the nonprofit world. But if you're in government, it's pretty 9 to 5. All that is to say, there are cultural, I think, differences that could throw things for a loop, even on the right.
Yeah, I think I'll be honest. I think I definitely have my concerns about stuff that's going on, but I think hearing the culture shock was something that I was hoping for when I was like looking forward to this administration coming in. My thing was going to be, okay, if this administration is going to be the thing that I think it's going to be, the first 30 days are going to be absolutely wild, and boy, was that delivered. I mean, from not just from the actual the actions and the like what was going on, the policies, the executive orders, Doge, making a ruckus, but the coverage of it has been unbelievable. It's like the media landscape has exploded. And I don't know if you've noticed this too, like you're media. It's like before Trump got into office, I felt like the left side of the political spectrum, the independents on YouTube specifically, were about 1/10 of the size they are now. Like when I'm going on YouTube and watching that coverage, that entire side of the spectrum has just exploded with commentary, exploding with, oh my God, these people are destroying everything, so on and so forth. What that signals is that I think there is an opportunity for the Democrat Party to really capitalize on some of the chaos that has been caused. So let me ask you this: Do you think their best bet right now is to just put Bernie and AOC at the front of the party and let them lead? Or do you think, my personal opinion is that if Doge and Trump are somewhat successful, even somewhat successful, and let's say they get close to balancing a budget by his term, by the end of his term, and there's clear progress towards that in the midterms, and Doge, the actions are actually showing up in the budget in the fiscal year 26 and 27, I see a very difficult path for the Democrat Party to make any sort of comeback short of major labor disruption. I'm curious to hear your take. Like, what do you think the Democrats need to do in the coming 12 months?
I think they have to be anti-establishment. And the only reason that Donald Trump is anti-establishment is that, or the only reason the Republican Party is anti-establishment is that Donald Trump forced them to virtually at gunpoint during the primary battle in 2015 and 2016. He had to drag them kicking and screaming, and it didn't really happen until actually after the lawfare against him started, which if you talk to a lot of professional conservatives in DC, they will say it is what opened up their eyes, that this was deeper than Donald Trump, that this was, that Donald Trump was sort of the proxy battle for the soul of the country. And so for Democrats, I mean, the right just wins on that beyond like ideological conservatives because the rest of the country hates the establishment right now. Like institutional trust is at record lows across the board. And so when you have a climate like that, the person who is erring on the side of being against the status quo has a baked in advantage. And we saw a very half-hearted effort on behalf of Kamala Harris to act like she was against corporate greed and act like she was against, the like higher powers in the economy, but nobody believed it. It wasn't a central focus of the campaign. And more importantly, she represented the status quo via Biden, and people hated that status quo. So I think for Democrats, Bernie Sanders is absolutely an advantage, but what we've seen with Gavin Newsom, actually, I think he's like one of the most overrated, but actually in a weird way underrated politicians. Like he's overrated in the sense that he has been slick and smooth in California, but underrated in the sense that I think he actually could be nationally really potent because he's such a chameleon. And he's now he just did an interview when he launched his podcast with Charlie Kirk, where he actually what was interesting about that is he understands that what people, especially swing voters, value right now is transparency. They want to look like you are like being authentic. And if you can sit for a 3-hour podcast interview and convince them that what you're saying is genuine, like they might disagree with you, but they might be like, yeah. And so I think what he said, sort of going against the party on trans issues, even BLM, having some pushback on the cultural stuff, Democrats don't understand that people view those unpopular culture war issues actually as the entrenched establishment position. So it's not just on economics. So I think you have to be able to combine Bernieism, which I'm not sure that Gavin Newsom can do, with a cultural critique of the establishment. And I haven't seen a Democrat do that very well yet. You see it sometimes. People talk about it, but it mostly comes from like, more Marxists or people like my friend Ryan Graham, who are able to say like the cultural issues were used by the elite to enrich themselves. And Bernie has not yet really nailed that argument. AOC has definitely not nailed that argument. I doubt that Gavin Newsom can do it, but he showed, at least in the like Marshall McLuhanian sense, he understands that the medium is now the message, meaning just by launching a podcast that looks real, it doesn't look like one of these, some people launch a podcast, like Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy looked like insane.
Not good.
No, not at all.
Not good.
She missed the mark on the aesthetics and understanding the medium. So that's a start. But I think you really have to be able to stake out a position that is like, we are against the elites, because Musk and Trump have been very successful at that. And whether or not you believe them, a lot of people are willing to put their trust in them over the status quo that Democrats represent.